Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel, and if you're new here, make sure to subscribe because today we're tackling something that is incredibly frustrating and confusing, feeling anxious when there is no clear reason for it. You know that feeling, right? You wake up with this sense of dread in your chest, your mind is racing, your body feels tense and on edge. But when you try to figure out what you're anxious about, you come up blank. There's no obvious stressor, no deadline looming, no conflict happening, nothing you can point to and say, that's why I feel this way. And somehow, that makes it even worse, because at least if you knew what you were anxious about, you could try to address it or rationalize it. But this free-floating anxiety that has no apparent cause? It feels like you're losing your mind, like your anxiety is malfunctioning, or like there's something fundamentally wrong with you. Scientifically documented reasons why you can feel intensely anxious without a clear external cause. And once you understand these mechanisms, the anxiety becomes less frightening and more manageable. So today we're diving into the psychology and neuroscience of seemingly random anxiety, why your brain and body might be generating these feelings without obvious triggers, and what you can actually do about it. Let's start with a fundamental truth that changes everything. Anxiety doesn't always originate from conscious thoughts or external situations. Sometimes anxiety is generated by processes happening beneath your conscious awareness in your nervous system. Your body, your subconscious mind, and your conscious brain is basically the last to know. You feel the anxiety first, and then your thinking mind scrambles to figure out what could possibly be causing it, often incorrectly attributing it to whatever happens to be on your mind at that moment. This is called misattribution, and it's a common source of confusion. You might feel anxious because of something purely physiological happening in your body, but your mind assumes it must be about that email you need to send or that conversation you had yesterday, when actually those things have nothing to do with it. One of the most common but overlooked causes of seemingly random anxiety is your autonomic nervous system being dysregulated. Your autonomic nervous system has two branches: the sympathetic nervous system, which is your accelerator and activates during stress, and the parasympathetic nervous system, which is your brake and activates during rest and recovery. These systems are supposed to work in balance, shifting back and forth as needed. But chronic stress, trauma, poor sleep, or sustained life pressures can dysregulate this system, leaving you stuck with your sympathetic nervous system overactive. When this happens, your body is generating anxiety symptoms: elevated heart rate, shallow breathing, muscle tension, hypervigilance, not because you're thinking anxious thoughts, but because your nervous system is literally stuck in a low-level threat state. You feel anxious because your body is physiologically anxious, and your mind is just along for the ride trying to figure out why. This is bottom-up anxiety, where the signal starts in your body and moves up to your brain, rather than top-down anxiety, where a thought triggers a physical response. Let's talk about something called interoceptive awareness, which is your ability to sense what's happening inside your body. Some people have very high interoceptive awareness, meaning they're very attuned to their internal physical sensations: heartbeat, breathing, digestive processes, muscle tension, temperature changes. While this can be useful, it can also make you more prone to anxiety because you're constantly picking up subtle signals from your body. You might notice your heart rate increase slightly from standing up, or feel your breathing shift from changing positions, or sense tension developing in your muscles. And your brain interprets these normal physiological variations as potential threats. This creates anxiety not because anything is wrong, but because you're hyper-aware of your body's normal fluctuations and your brain has learned to respond to them with alarm. This is particularly common in people who've had panic attacks or health anxiety. Their interoceptive awareness becomes hypersensitive, constantly monitoring for signs of danger. Another huge factor is accumulated stress that you haven't processed or released. Think of your nervous system like a stress bucket. Every stressor, worry, conflict, demand, or challenge adds a little more to the bucket. If you're regularly emptying the bucket through rest, processing emotions, physical activity, connection, or other stress relief practices, it stays manageable. But if you're just constantly adding to it without emptying it, maybe you're pushing through, staying busy, not dealing with emotions, not taking real breaks, eventually that bucket fills up and starts overflowing. When this happens, you feel anxious even when nothing specific is happening in the moment, because your nervous system is maxed out. You're experiencing the cumulative effect of all the stress you've been carrying, even if each individual stressor seems small or manageable. It's not about any one thing, it's about everything together exceeding your capacity. This is why anxiety often seems to appear out of nowhere during relatively calm moments. Your nervous system finally has space to signal that it is overwhelmed. And all that accumulated stress surfaces as generalized anxiety. Let's discuss the role of your subconscious mind, because a lot of anxiety-generating processing happens outside your conscious awareness. Your subconscious is constantly scanning your environment, your relationships, your life circumstances, and your internal state, picking up patterns, inconsistencies, or potential threats that your conscious mind isn't attending to. Maybe there's something subtly off in a relationship that you haven't consciously acknowledged, or you're sensing that your job situation isn't sustainable long-term, or some part of you recognizes that you're not living aligned with your values, or you're picking up on subtle social cues that something is wrong. Your subconscious registers these things and generates anxiety as a signal that something needs attention. But because you're not consciously aware of what that something is, the anxiety feels random and sourceless. This is actually your anxiety trying to communicate with you. It's not malfunctioning. It's doing its job of alerting you to something, but the message isn't getting through clearly to your conscious mind. There's also something called semantic satiation of worry, which is when you've been anxious for so long that the specific worries start to blur together or fade, but the anxious state remains. You might have initially been anxious about specific things, work stress, relationship concerns, health worries, but over time your nervous system learns to just be anxious as a baseline state, independent of specific content. The anxiety becomes a habit, a default setting, and it continues even when the original triggers have resolved or changed. This is particularly common in generalized anxiety disorder, where worry becomes so pervasive and chronic that it detaches from specific causes and becomes a constant background state of your existence. Let's talk about hormonal and biochemical factors, because your emotional state is significantly influenced by your body chemistry, and this chemistry can fluctuate for reasons that have nothing to do with your circumstances. Thyroid dysfunction, particularly hyperthyroidism, can create symptoms that are virtually identical to anxiety, racing heart, nervousness, irritability, difficulty concentrating. Blood sugar fluctuations from skipping meals or eating high-sugar foods can trigger anxiety symptoms as your body responds to the glucose crash. Caffeine sensitivity can cause anxiety, and if you're a regular caffeine user, you might not even realize it as affecting you because you've adapted to a baseline level of caffeine-induced jitteriness. Hormonal changes during menstrual cycles, pregnancy, perimenopause, or menopause can significantly impact anxiety levels. Vitamin deficiencies, particularly B vitamins, magnesium, or vitamin D, can contribute to increased anxiety. And medications, even ones you've been taking for a while, can have anxiety as a side effect. All of these physiological factors can generate very real anxiety without any psychological trigger whatsoever. And because you can't see or identify these internal chemical processes, the anxiety seems to have no cause. Now let's discuss sleep deprivation and circadian rhythm disruption, which are massive but often overlooked contributors to anxiety. When you're not getting adequate sleep, or when your sleep schedule is irregular, your emotional regulation centers, particularly the prefrontal cortex, function less effectively, while your amygdala, which generates fear and anxiety responses, becomes hyperactive. Sleep-deprived brains literally perceive more threat and generate more anxiety in response to the same stimuli that wouldn't bother you when well rested. Additionally, REM sleep is crucial for emotional processing. This is when your brain sorts through and consolidates emotional experiences. When you don't get enough REM sleep, emotions and stress don't get properly processed, and they accumulate and manifest as generalized anxiety. You might feel inexplicably anxious the day after poor sleep, not because anything happened, but because your brain literally doesn't have the resources to regulate emotions effectively and hasn't processed yesterday's experiences adequately. There is also the phenomena of anticipatory anxiety that has become so automatic you don't even recognize it as anticipation anymore. If you've lived with anxiety for a long time, you might have developed a habit of constantly scanning the future for potential problems, dangers, or things that could go wrong. This future-oriented worry becomes so ingrained that it runs in the background constantly, generating a steady stream of low-level anxiety even when you can't identify what specifically you're worried about. You're essentially anxious about the possibility of something anxiety-provoking happening, which is anxiety about anxiety, which creates this self-sustaining cycle where the anxiety doesn't need external content anymore, it feeds on itself. Let us talk about the impact of modern life and chronic low-level stressors that become so accustomed to that we don't register them as stressors anymore. But they absolutely impact our nervous systems. Constant connectivity and notification overload keeps your brain in a reactive, alert state. Information overload and exposure to global crises and disturbing news creates a sense of overwhelm and threat, even when nothing is immediately threatening you. Social comparison through social media generates ongoing feelings of inadequacy and competition. The pace and demands of modern work culture create sustained pressure. Environmental factors like noise pollution, air quality, or living in crowded urban spaces are constant low-grade stressors. Financial precarity or instability, even if you're currently okay, creates background anxiety. These aren't dramatic stressors that you'd identify as the reason you're anxious, but collectively they keep your nervous system in a sustained state of activation that manifests as generalized, sourceless anxiety. There's also something called free-floating anxiety in psychodynamic theory, which suggests that sometimes anxiety represents repressed or unacknowledged emotions, conflicts, or desires. Maybe there's anger you're not allowing yourself to feel, or grief you haven't processed, or needs you're not acknowledging, or aspects of yourself or your life that you're avoiding looking at directly. When emotions or truths are pushed out of conscious awareness, they don't disappear, they often resurface as anxiety. The anxiety is the emotional energy that has to go somewhere, and because you're not allowing yourself to feel or address the actual emotion or issue, it manifests as this vague, unattached, anxious feeling. This is your psyche's way of saying, something needs attention here, but the something remains obscured. Now let's discuss what you can actually do about anxiety that seems to have no cause, because understanding the mechanisms is just the first step. First, track your anxiety alongside potential physical factors, sleep quality, caffeine intake, meal timing, menstrual cycle if applicable, activity level, and see if patterns emerge. You might discover that your random anxiety actually correlates with specific physiological factors. Second, consider that the cause might be cumulative stress or nervous system dysregulation rather than a specific trigger, and focus on practices that regulate your nervous system. Vagal nerve exercises, regular exercise, meditation, spending time in nature, or working with a somatic therapist. These approaches work on the nervous system directly, rather than trying to find and fix a specific thought pattern. Third, develop better interoceptive literacy. Learn to distinguish between my body is doing something normal and my mind is overreacting, versus my body is genuinely signaling something important. This takes practice but significantly reduces anxiety generated from misinterpreting normal body sensations. Fourth, create regular practices for emptying your stress bucket. Build in genuine rest. Process emotions through journaling or therapy, move your body, connect meaningfully with others, and engage in activities that help you feel regulated and grounded. This prevents the accumulation that leads to overflow anxiety. Fifth, work with a therapist, particularly if this is ongoing, because they can help you identify subconscious patterns, process underlying emotions, address root causes, and develop more effective regulation strategies. Sometimes anxiety that seems sourceless is actually pointing towards something important that needs to be brought into awareness. And therapy is the space where that can happen safely. Sixth, get a medical checkup to rule out physiological causes. Thyroid function, blood sugar, vitamin levels, and medication review can all be important pieces. And seventh, practice accepting that sometimes you'll feel anxious without knowing exactly why, and that's okay. The anxiety doesn't need to be fixed or explained immediately. You can acknowledge it, make space for it, and continue functioning while giving your system time and space to process whatever it's working through. Fighting against the anxiety or becoming anxious about being anxious usually makes it worse. If this video helped you feel less alone in experiencing this, please give it a thumbs up and share it with someone who needs to hear this. Drop a comment. Do you experience anxiety that seems to come from nowhere? What helps you? And please, if anxiety is significantly impacting your life, reach out to a mental health professional. Unexplained anxiety is treatable. You're not going crazy. And there are real reasons and real solutions even when the cause isn't obvious. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.